Good morning. My name is Mark Silver. I'm presenting a series of programs for YouTube. These have all been included in continuing legal education courses that I've done for immigration, criminal, and civil litigation lawyers for many, many years. My lectures have been heard by tens of thousands of attorneys in the United States, but I'm putting them now on YouTube so they're available for everyone for free. And I'm also including a set of new programs on forensics and mitigation, which is my specialty, so that people can have, who practice, a broader sense of emotional, psychological, humanistic issues. I'm a psychiatric social worker working in New York. I'm also a lawyer. I have a doctorate in psychology, a background in mental health, political science, family systems, and other areas. My underlying concern in all these programs is to help lawyers understand how to humanize the client, how to work with the client and elicit information from the client so that we understand the criminal defendant as a real human being, someone who's had or encountered challenges or traumas, tribulations, often in earlier developmental periods in childhood or adolescence. It's something extremely crucial that unfortunately we're not really taught in law school. We're not taught how to interview clients. We're not taught how to elicit information or how to gain their trust. And many of our clients have had very difficult situations in their lives, and this is particularly true for clients in the areas that I specialize in, which is immigration, criminal, and civil litigation. The program today is something that's become a huge part of my practice, and that concerns domestic violence. I've undertaken hundreds and hundreds of domestic violence evaluations for immigration defense lawyers. And at some point, I began to get referrals from criminal defense lawyers as well, and I've done many of those cases mostly for consultative purposes. I'm just finishing one now in Chicago. There's a lot of material that overlaps between this program for criminal defense lawyers today and for immigration defense lawyers that I've done in the past. The reality is that criminal defense lawyers and immigration defense lawyers have a lot in common in terms of the kinds of work they do, the kinds of clients, and so on, but they're really engaged in two separate worlds in many respects. And for that reason, I've developed this program, which I've also done as a CLE, for criminal defense lawyers specifically, taking hopefully the best of the material that I'm familiar with. I hate to do it, but I'm going to tell you about my book again, Handbook of Mitigation in Criminal and Immigration Forensics. This book actually has a specific chapter for immigration defense lawyers on what we're going to talk about today, which is domestic violence. This is the 7th edition. Honestly, my books are incredibly inexpensive. I also have another book called Psychosocial Evaluations and Consultation. Everything's available on my website. But I wrote the second book to help lawyers understand how to engage with clients, specifically those clients who've had difficulties communicating, those who don't have perhaps a lot of psychological insight, but more importantly, understanding how psychosocial evaluations are undertaken. And those are sort of the gold standard for eliciting information to understanding people in a clinical context. I do want to say I try to integrate theory with practice. Please don't hesitate to email me. I'll send you back a redacted sample of a case I've done very recently, actually, so that what I'm talking about today in the areas that are clinically challenging that I'm presenting can be integrated for practical use. If you do send me an email, just put in the subject line something about this program today, like domestic violence. And in the email, tell me who you are so I know it's not spam. Put your full name, address, information. I won't send you back junk, I promise. But I get a lot of spam. I just want to make sure it's a real attorney. And I'll send you back a redacted sample of a case. domestic violence in criminal defense cases concern harm. There's an accusation of harm. And that is one of my most central concerns in immigration defense work that I do. In these evaluations, whether it's spousal abuse or asylum, U visa cases, or even for civil litigation lawyers and personal injury, someone has suffered harm. And here in domestic violence situations for criminal defense cases, you have a defendant who's been accused of causing harm. And what I'd like to do is take an unusual approach today and look at the backdoor conceptualization of these problems by looking at the purported victims in these cases. So the very first thing that I would say is that domestic violence, harm in domestic violence situations, in almost all cases is not an event. It's a series of events. And in almost all those cases, therefore, you have complex trauma, which hopefully we'll get to on today's program. If you're in a car accident, that's a single event. With domestic violence, it's almost always that the victim suffers repeated and chronic stress because they're marinated in trauma because of repeated physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, verbal, and other kinds of abuses. The abuse that the victim suffers tends to be, in the large majority or vast majority of cases, purposeful, malignant, and hateful. Those are the three: purposeful, malignant, and hateful. It's often thought that there are cycles of abuse, and I'll give you one very typical example. You have a guy who comes home on Friday with a check. He goes and cashes the check, and he uses the money to get drunk. And Friday night he comes home drunk, and he's physically, emotionally, sexually abusive. Saturday morning he sleeps it off. He goes out drinking again. He's abusive again. Sunday morning he sleeps it off. He's had enough of alcohol. He starts getting ready for work. The victim knows that she's safe. And in fact, she may remain relatively safe throughout Sunday and even Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. This is a set pattern where an alcoholic abuses the drug dependent on his income after finishing work for the week, and becomes abusive on the weekend. That is called a set pattern, and you have considerable predictability. Predictability as to the abuser's behavior, but also predictability from the victim's standpoint as to what she may or may not experience. In reality, though, in the large majority of cases that I see, there is no set pattern of abuse. This is very similar to immigration defense cases for asylum. When someone has suffered human rights violations or persecution in their country of origin, the person rarely suffers those harms in their country of origin in a set or patterned manner. In reality, most victims who suffer domestic violence don't suffer patterns of abuse. It can be arbitrary, it can be capricious, it can be based on blind hatred, racism, psychopathy. It can be very idiosyncratic. It may be culturally approved so that it's not based in any kind of identifiable cycle. The abuser may act without reason or without any known reason. And it's very important to understand this. Why? Because in the absence of patterns of harm, there's actually greater psychological harm. If you're harmed in a way that's predictable, then you as a victim gain certainty. If you gain certainty, you'll actually suffer less stress and mental health issues and physical problems and so on because of the knowledge that you can make a prediction. If you have no sense about when harm will occur to you, if there's a gate that's electric, and every time you touch that gate you get shocked, there's a set predictability of outcome. But if you touch that gate and you're shocked only every second time or every eighth time, or you just don't know because there's a person controlling the shock with a button, you won't have any sense of predictability. And even though you may suffer many less shocks touching that gate, you will actually suffer much higher levels of stress because of the uncertainty. One of the largest groups to suffer in the practice that I have are immigrant women, but I've seen many, many men as well who have been victims. And they've been victims predominantly because without immigration status in the United States, they are victims to predators who can be very manipulative and coercive regarding the victim's immigration status. And the victim may suffer all sorts of verbal threats regarding the individual's safety. There can be a wide range of financial harms, including extortion and so on. One of the things I would really try to emphasize when you're looking at your criminal defendants in these cases, trying to understand the abuse that did or did not occur, is to look for something called pre-abuse. And this is something that is not usually regarded very seriously. What's regarded most seriously are actual categories of abuse, which we'll get to next. However, in the large majority, maybe the vast majority of cases, there is pre-abuse. And what does that entail? It means that the victim feels an erosion of trust. There's a breakdown of communication. There are hints of real abuse. Often in these situations, the abuser is acting more irritable, angry. They're staying away from home more. They direct blame much more frequently towards the victim. The attitude, the sense of commitment and trust between the two individuals begins to break down. And this can occur not weeks, but sometimes months or even years before the actual core elements of abuse become manifest. The first major area of abuse, of course, is physical abuse. Physical abuse is defined as the unwanted contact by the abusing spouse to his partner and include anything physical: kicking, hitting, slapping, pushing, shoving, kneeing, spitting, blocking, scratching, pulling hair, tripping, choking, and so on. And I've seen all of these. However, physical abuse can also be direct if there's an intermediary, and this is not always asked about, but it's crucial, and that concerns use of an object. And I'll give you a very typical example. I see a lot of cases where abusers throw things and break things in the home, often throwing things or breaking things directed at the victim. And sometimes the victim suffers no injury because you throw a glass plate, it shatters on the wall right next to the victim's head. It's very frightening, but there is no direct physical harm. Again, I'm trying for criminal defense lawyers today to understand the perspective of the cases I've seen in immigration defense work so they understand their perspective and how to battle these cases from a defensive point of view from the claimed behavior and injury. But there are other kinds of physical abuses as well that are not asked about. I'll give you a few examples. Sometimes an abuser will turn off the heat in the middle of winter or turn up the AC in the middle of an inappropriate weather point. The abuser may force the victim to sleep on the couch or sleep on the floor or lock the victim outside of the home, and so on. They may also strand the person. I've seen many cases, for example, where the victim will go for a drive with the abuser. The abuser will tell the victim to get out, and it's 10, 20 miles from their home, and the person has no money, and so on. Some physical abuse obviously also occurs in the context of others, and I always ask about what may have been the abuser's history of abuse towards others, any criminal history, and so on. Next is psychological abuse. This concerns predominantly control and manipulation. Control, meaning controlling the person's social contacts, phone calls, mail, and so on. Manipulation tends to be more passive in nature. Coercion tends to be more active in nature, but they're all psychologically abusive elements. A huge one that I see is isolation, physical, but also psychological isolation, where the victim finds themselves unable to engage in the community or engage with friends or family. There's also psychological abuse because of absence, and I see this very often. This occurs where an abuser may leave the victim all night or for a few days and not say where he is, and the victim is actually concerned that the abuser may be in jail in a car accident he doesn't know. This adds to elements of uncertainty that the victim suffers, and it allows the abuser to maintain stronger control over the victim. Again, we hear these cases from the point of view of the criminal defendant, because that's the work we do. And I do, mitigation as an expert for criminal defendants. But it's important to understand what the purported victim is trying to assert. Separate from psychological abuse are emotional abuses. Most lawyers mix these up, and they're close cousins. But the difference is that emotional abuse concerns emotions, that concern feelings. This occurs where the abuser manipulates the person, not just physically or structurally in some way, but manipulates their feelings, causes them to feel angry or guilty or sad or constantly anxious, and so on. Another area, obviously, is verbal abuse. There are very different kinds of verbal abuse. I'm just going to mention a few. It's really defined generally as any negative or derogatory words directed at the victim, including disguised jokes, accusing, blaming, judging, criticizing, trivializing, undermining, threatening, name-calling, demeaning, and so on. But often verbal abuse also occurs in the context of racial, cultural, or religious slurs, outright expletives, especially expletives that occur as a part of the abuser's ordinary vocabulary, threats of harm or threats of death. This occurs more often than you might think, and it's important to be aware of it. Some of this occurs in the context of friends or family. It's unusual. The vast majority of harm in terms of domestic cases that I see occurs privately in the person's home. But cases, examples that occur publicly with friends or family, or not even friends or family, the couple may be, for example, shopping at the mall, and their onlookers who are also shopping should be asked about for various reasons. Interestingly enough, I have found that victim self-esteem is most damaged through verbal abuse. When they're told they're worthless, that they're ugly or fat, or, words and phrases that fundamentally undermine their sense of self, sense of well-being, sense of safety, and so on. And at that point, the victim may come to internalize and even believe what the victim is saying. The next major area of abuse is sexual abuse. It includes any unwanted sexual touching or contact. There may be physical harm in the context of sexual abuse. So, for example, if there's very forced or rough sex, it may result in damage. It may result in bruising, bleeding even, and other problems. Some victims are harmed by objects such as sex toys. Some victims that I see actually have a history of normal and even positive sexual interaction with the abuser. But the abuser demands sex at a time that the victim doesn't want it for one reason or another, and that's also obviously something that falls in the category of abuse. And it becomes very difficult for the victim because the victim has both positive interaction sexually with the abuser, but also very negative and outright abusive. There's also different kinds of forced sex that need to be considered, including cunnilingus, analingus, fellatio, and so on. These are very difficult subjects, especially when you have to ask about forced anal sex, which may cause tissue damage, bleeding, excessive pain, and so on. Verbal sexual degradation. I actually hear this much more when the man is the victim of abuse. He is told by his partner that he performs poorly, that she is dissatisfied with him, that he's not a real man, and that she will go elsewhere for her sexual needs. Infidelity also falls under this category. It's a betrayal of trust. And as an extension of this, I do ask about STDs. In general, if the victim has noticed any infections or problems that they themselves have to contend with or gain over-the-counter medication, or even report to their physicians. Financial abuse is another huge area. It includes the withholding or misuse of personal or joint funds, including legal transactions. Financial abuse makes the abused spouse typically physically reliant on the abuser for food, shelter, and all other basic necessities, including sometimes transportation money to travel to and from work. Many times, the victim is prohibited from supporting his or her family. They may lose employment or may be restricted in employment. I've seen cases where the abuser forces the victim to get 2 jobs to support the home. At the other end of the extreme, I've seen many cases where the abuser prohibits the victim from going into the community to work because the abuser wants to keep the victim structurally confined to the home and wants to limit her interaction, not just with work, but with the community in general. Many times the abuser will withhold paychecks or take paychecks, withhold funds. I see many cases where there's extortion, especially in immigration cases, where the abuser will say, give me $500. If you don't, I will call immigration and report you, say you're here without status, and you may be detained or deported. Joint bank accounts are often depleted by abusers. They may be outright stealing from wallets, jewelry, and so on. And quite often the abuser has a spending problem, meaning the abuser spends out of control for one reason or another. The abuser may be quite impulsive for different psychiatric reasons, or the abuser may be using drugs or alcohol, and there's expense involved with drugs and alcohol and partying and going to clubs, and that's another reason for the financial abuse. I see in about half the cases religious or cultural abuse in one form or another. Don't forget, I see a lot of clients who relocate to the United States, and in almost all cases, they marry people from different cultures or backgrounds, ethnicities, certainly geographies, and so on. And there may be cultural or racial slurs in different ways. I have a lot of clients, who are, for example, prohibited from praying. The abuser will take away the victim's Bible or prohibit them from attending temple or church, and so on. There may be third parties in the home, elderly people that suffer as a result of the abuser. There may also be children in the home, and this is important to note, depending on the case and the legal ramifications, but also the abuse and neglect ramifications. Very importantly in today's world is technology abuse. Does the abuser control the person's phone or the smartphone, computers, digital devices, social media passwords, and so on? Our phones today, we don't talk a lot on our phones. We text, but most importantly, they're smartphones. They allow us to communicate, use the internet. There's a host of information on our phones. They're really smartphones. They're mini computers. And controlling someone's phone in this way can be very damaging to the victim. I see a lot of cases with clients who consider things to be culturally appropriate. I saw a woman, this was about 2.5 months ago, who had suffered repeated anal sex, even causing her pain and tissue damage and so on. And we spoke. This is an educated woman who was very eloquent, and we talked about her background and so on. But she was forthright in saying, she just at the time didn't consider it appropriate. She saw her mother in her home growing up, living as a second-class citizen to her father in their culture. And she sort of felt here that she had to concede and defer to her husband, and whatever sexual demands he made, he had to, be superior in that manner. And obviously this woman had suffered repeated inappropriate sexual assault, rape, and I documented it. But it's important to really work objectively with an understanding of these situations, but also subjectively, so that people who have suffered harm speak about their harm openly and speak about the relationship openly. If the abuser uses drug or alcohol, or if the abuser has a true addiction, it magnifies the problem in all sorts of ways. I'll give you one example. Many alcoholics suffer blackouts, and I will see cases where the person truly has little or no memory of the harm that they caused the night before to the abuser, or they may become, the next day after abusing alcohol, very ill because they have withdrawal symptoms. They may have headaches, they may feel achy, they may be vomiting, they may have to lie down and get sleep and take a few showers. It's after a hangover and they have withdrawal. In many of these cases, the victim then feels very sympathetic for the abuser because the abuser becomes sick when not using the drugs, paradoxically. So there are many issues related to not just the abuser's behavior because of using drugs, but the dynamic between the victim and the abuser. Many of the abusers who use harder drugs may also be selling drugs. And if they're selling drugs, they may have people coming into the home who are dangerous during drug sales, and that also needs to be considered. In other words, the internal environment of the home itself. What I want to turn now to is complex trauma. I want to just talk about it for a minute. I know we have different labels for victims of abuse and domestic violence situations, including battered women syndrome and so on, and they have merit. But there's something underlying these that really I want to talk about for a minute, and that is complex trauma. Complex trauma is really something that is borrowed from a child pathology where a child suffers repeated physical, sexual, emotional, verbal abuse over many years, perhaps even throughout their entire childhood and adolescence. And it causes emotional and neurological developmental harm to the child. It prohibits the child from developing a healthy self-esteem. They cannot self-regulate their emotions, and their ability to relate to other people can be terribly damaged, and they have chronically high levels of stress. A caregiver's bond is normally the fundamental source of stability, safety, security, and certainty in a child's life, and the lack of a healthy and reliable primary attachment can fundamentally undermine the child's development. It's very similar in adult relationships. When the victim suffers repeated physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, financial, and so on abuses over many months and certainly over many years, it fundamentally not only makes the relationship toxic, obviously, but healthy bonds of any kind are impossible. Proper physical bonding is impossible. The victim suffers from chronic stress, cannot continue to develop with any sense of certainty or predictability or safety or love as an adult, and adults do go through levels of development as well. And these chronic levels of stress make it impossible for the victim to think or live in a healthy way. If you're constantly thinking about your safety and security, you have no brain power left over to think about other things in life. You can't be curious, you can't wonder, you can't focus on love. You can't learn to take care of yourself or others. You question who you are. because the victimhood that you suffer is so overwhelming. And the heightened levels of stress really make you focus on this particular issue, which is, when is the next time my safety will be threatened? And in general, when the survival brain is active, the learning brain is dulled, meaning the person can't develop themselves in the workplace, in educational programs, or in general. One extremely important thing for criminal defense lawyers to understand from all this, it's probably the single most important thing to understand, is that it creates a value system and a lens through which to see the world. So you see these victims of harm, and they may have acted, in a negative way towards the abuser. They may have fought back and so on. Some of these victims may look even psychopathic, but it's extremely important to understand that what's happened is, because they were the victim of harm in so many different ways repeatedly for so long, it created a value system. This is particularly true if the victim was also the victim of not only domestic violence, but was also the victim of childhood trauma in various forms, and especially if that childhood trauma was also repeated as the victim has suffered repeated harm in his or her adulthood. Once you change a person's value system, then the person's outlook on life, how they understand and process information, how they evaluate right versus wrong, survival versus non-survival, becomes incredibly influenced. I just want to say generally that with complex trauma, there are systemic neurological and cognitive damage. There's constant confusion, as I mentioned before, because the survival brain is active and the learning brain is dulled. There's often overreactive nervous system. The brain, nervous, emotional system suffers from dysregulation. There's constant distress and pain. The victim feels there's just no exit to all of this. Hypervigilance, which means there's exaggerated startle response often. The person never feels at ease or self-confident, safe, or stable. The person may suffer tendencies to overreact. They will not process information properly. The victim may not be able to learn new information. Their train of thought or even right words may be garbled. Their memory, short-term, long-term memory, may be harmed. How they understand themselves and the world around them, but also how they communicate behaviorally, verbally, and so on. As a result of all this, their judgment, their planning, their insight, their decision-making has been damaged. This leads to emotional consequences of shame and humiliation, fears and anxieties, that the victim may feel that they'll never gain equilibrium again, that what they're feeling may result in a permanent state of terror. Hopes and dreams may be undermined. They may see things very darkly, that there's only doom and hatred in the world. The victim may be constantly exhausted and feeling physically, emotionally overwhelmed. They themselves may not be able to modulate their rage and anger. They may have an inescapable feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, overwhelming despair. Their normal coping mechanisms may have been shattered. They may not be able to process or execute flight or fight responses. Sometimes these individuals have at their core a sense of betrayal, deception, and they develop not only a distrust of others, but the victim may also develop a distrust of their own judgment. The abuser may think, look, this has been going on for weeks, months. I must have done something wrong. I must in some way be part of the abuser's thinking, how he views the world. Otherwise, he wouldn't stay with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't stay with him. I have to be part of this in some way. I can't just be an arbitrary victim. Some of these victims also develop obvious sexual dysfunction, including a distrust of intimacy. Some lose their faith in God and have a spiritual crisis. for some time stands still, and many victims that I've interviewed have difficulty pinpointing specific instances of harm. It's also true that in complex trauma where there's repeated instances of harm, you almost always get people who collapse multiple instances of harm. And I'll just give you one example. I'll see victims who've been called stupid repeatedly. If it really happens that often, the victim is not going to be able to place a specific day and time when that particular abuse occurs. And the abuser, because he's using the word so much, will cause the victim to collapse these multiple memories into a single recollection. Some of these victims will also suffer existential crises, negativity, feeling that life makes no sense, there's no value to living, that existence is meaningless because it's all about suffering. Some of these victims lose their capacity to feel empathy for others. And when you don't feel empathy for others, and you have your value system pathologically altered because of the harms you suffered from the abuser, it makes you look like a psychopath a little bit, but you're not. Your client is not necessarily psychopathic or antisocial in their presentation. They have been victims, and the victimhood has shaped their inability to feel care and empathy for others. It has shaped and impaired their value system. I just want to share with you a few important caveats. First, the severity of a single incident can be systemically damaging. It's true I'm talking about people who've been the victims of repeated harm, but please understand that a single incident can be damaging. And it's possible that you have a client as a criminal defense lawyer who committed a particular instance of harm towards a victim, and because there are multiple instances of harm in this relationship historically, that it may not be singled out or properly remembered by your client. Second, microaggressions can add up to systemically damaging harm. I often see clients who actually suffer little or no physical abuse, but they suffer these little, harms, these little indignities, verbally, emotionally, and otherwise. And over many years, the impact on the victim is actually quite serious. These clients often experience harm in idiosyncratic ways. It's important to understand objectively and subjectively what's occurred. And I'll just give you a really personal example. My maternal grandparents, probably about 80 years ago, had a serious car accident. And they weren't harmed. They went down a hill. They weren't wearing seatbelts, ironically, so they were thrown and they were okay. But as a result of this car accident, my grandfather never drove his car again. And my grandmother, the next day, drove, and she drove until she was about 80 years old. They were two very different individuals. My grandmother grew up very poor, but in Connecticut, in an intact family generally. And she was impulsive and a go-getter. Nothing scared her. My grandfather grew up as the victim of racism in Eastern Europe, and he was very conservative as a result. He was risk-aversive. After the car accident, he never got into the car again. He was a successful businessman, an intelligent person who read a lot, but he saw the car as a risk. Their separate subjective perceptions led to idiosyncratic outcomes. There are sometimes psychological attitudes towards the abuser that should be understood. There could be a codependent relationship or dependency for financial reasons, or one or both may engage with alcohol or drug use. Sometimes the victim feels that the abuser is deeply troubled, which may be true, and the victim thinks, I can help this person, I can save this person. Sometimes there's fear, confusion due to betrayal and deception. There can be sympathy. As I said, the abuser may be ill, psychologically, medically ill, physically ill. And again, the abuser may feel a deep sense of sympathy that keeps this relationship intact. There may be identification with the abuser for different reasons. Perhaps the victim experienced abuse in her family of origin by her father, and she understands this as normative, now living with her abusive male partner. Many victims are in denial. They do not properly understand or perceive or have the ability to parse out the different kinds of abuses and the seriousnesses of those abuses. Abuse thrives in silence in the dark, and it withers and becomes weak in the light. As long as these things remain in the dark privately within the confines of the home, they tend to continue in a somewhat consistent manner. Many times the victim just really feels self-blame, feels, I must have done something wrong to have brought this on. It's important in these kinds of cases to consider harm broadly. Consider not only how the client has been actively harmed, but what has been lost. That is, the victim may have lost a fundamental sense of their personhood, their self-esteem, self-confidence. They may have lost their ability to engage with other family, to enjoy or engage in the community. The person may have all sorts of interpersonal difficulties as a result of being a victim. Don't forget the eggshell rule. You take your plaintiff as you find him. And it's important to understand the backgrounds of the victim and the abuser to understand as best as possible their decision-making judgment and how they each exist in this particular position given their own predisposition. It's important, therefore, to understand their vulnerabilities, in what ways they're fragile, and in what ways these situations have been exacerbated by various personal issues and stressful issues that they've experienced. Sometimes it's helpful to look at functioning over narrative, meaning it's useful sometimes to look at the client's functioning before and after the abuse. In other words, look at how the person was functioning for several years before. Was this person leading a normal, healthy life? And versus now, having been the victim of abuse, is this person substantially different in how they're conducting themselves on a day-to-day basis? There may be self-imposed prohibitions. There may be all sorts of issues to consider here. If it's possible, look at the family as a whole. You get parallel interviews with family members. There's nothing better than that. Looking at how other people in the house or home function, including children. It's important to consider the purported issues for the victim's mental health as a criminal defense lawyer and understanding the ins and outs of PTSD, including stressors, intrusive symptoms, avoidance, negative alterations in cognition, and alterations in arousal and reactivity are important. In the clients that I see who've been the victim of abuse, the narrative of the abuse tends to flesh out the criteria and symptoms of PTSD itself. In other words, after an hour or two or three of speaking with somebody, I usually have, believe it or not, sufficient information and even examples that tell me about the PTSD so that I don't even have to ask necessarily specific questions. I'll just give you one very simple example. A lot of victims of abuse suffer from sleep disturbance, and many clients will say, I'll stay up very late at night because I don't want him to come in and then wake me up and scare me because I'm so panicky at that point. Well, that's obviously sleep disturbance, and it's actually a symptom in criterion E of PTSD. Many clients suffer from depression, obviously, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, despair, low energy, anhedonia, agitation or psychomotor retardation. They may feel worthless, or they may experience inappropriate or excessive guilt, difficulty or erratic appetites or sleep patterns. Concentration and focus may be poor. That's kind of obvious, but you should be aware that many clients also suffer from suicidality. Active suicidality occurs where a person has a plan to perhaps take a huge amount of pills to overdose to end their life. Passive suicidality occurs where the person thinks, gee, what would it be like if I can end my life by sleeping and sleeping and sleeping and not waking up so that my psychological pain can vanish? Suicidality is always about helpless feelings of overwhelming despair and deep psychological helpless pain. And there are different aspects of this that can give all sorts of insight into how the person views themselves. They may actually have self-hatred for being a victim or even being an abuser. They may feel useless, a burden to family members, and so on. Many of these clients have learned helplessness. It's basically a condition in which a person suffers from a sense of powerlessness arising from a traumatic event or persistent failure to succeed in some area of their life. And again, the person feels quite worthless about themselves. They may have excessive or inappropriate guilt. Victims of abuse in these situations often feel shame, humiliation, and self-blame for ever having become intimately involved with the abuser. The person may feel trapped or worthless and unloved in various ways. The person may report panic attacks. Those are physiological symptoms that the victim may encounter, including heart palpitations, sweating, choking feelings, chest pains, abdominal problems, and so on. There may be somatization where the person converts their anxiety into physical symptoms. If it's something that involves, for example, like the arm that becomes frozen, that's muscular and neurological perhaps, and it's often referred to as a conversion disorder. But trying to understand the connection between psychological and physical or medical even is not only important, it's integrative. It's crucial for these kinds of cases. Some of these clients have dissociative disorders. When fight or flight is not available to the victim, then the only option psychologically is to remove yourself from that place that's dangerous. Dissociative disorders are conditions that involve basic disruptions or breakdown of memory, awareness, identity, or perception. People with dissociative disorders use dissociation as a defense mechanism psychologically, often involuntarily. You should be aware that although fight and flight responses are very well known, there's two other things called fawning and freezing. And they're much more important, believe it or not. Fawning occurs where the victim tries to placate the abuser by matching the abuser's tone, body language, and so on. So trying to calm and keep the person who is abusing in a less agitated state. Freezing occurs where the victim literally freezes herself, somehow hoping that, by doing that, the danger will pass. Psychosis is not usually something that's asked about, but it's actually not uncommon with victims of abuse. They may have delusions, which are false beliefs. The person may have adaptive paranoia. For self-protection, the person may become very guarded, suspicious. They may have a low sense of trust in others. And the person may also experience hallucinations, which are false perceptions. And very typical case, I'll give you is I'll have a victim who maybe has been separated from the abuser for months and months, and I'll say, do you sometimes have the experience where you're walking down the street, you hear your name being called, you turn around, but nobody is there? And the victim says, yes, I have that quite a bit. Well, this is clearly the victim being hypervigilant while living with the abuser, but the hypervigilant remains for weeks, months, and sometimes years in various ways. A lot of victims I see of complex trauma look very ADHD-ish. They're very disorganized cognitively and otherwise in their daily life. And the person may have, ADHD or aspects of ADHD, but they're always kind of like ADHD-ish. They're shaky. They're uncertain about what they need to do. They're disorganized. Their focus is poor. They lose things. There may be psychomotor issues that complement this, and it's something to think about. The victim may turn to alcohol or drugs, either to match the abuser's use of alcohol or drugs in the home, but also to self-medicate. And it's important to ask about that as well. Some presentations can be very atypical. You have to be very culturally sensitive. It's something that we do because of the number of immigration clients seen here. But many clients I see, for them, psychiatric care is anathema to their cultural background, and mental health diagnoses are stigmatized. They may feel shame. They may be ignorant about mental health care. They may not have the resources. They may not be able to access clinics. It may be the situation that the victim feels that they're unable to talk about these things because they think, oh, no one would understand. Some of these clients have intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities. Some of these clients may have very poor self-advocacy, and the client really must be given time to tell their own story. It's important that clients do not under-exaggerate or over-exaggerate. It's important to consider also that it is not unidirectional. I know this is not very PC to say, but in many cases when there's abuse in the home, it goes both ways. I'm not saying one person may not be more abusive and one person may not be more dangerous. I'm simply saying that it's not unusual to see cases where both individuals are abusive in different ways toward one another. So what I've tried to do today is provide for the criminal defense lawyer a view from my perspective, having done perhaps 1,000 cases for immigration defense lawyers whose clients have been the victims of harm, to understand the victim's perspective while also considering the dynamics of the criminal defendant. I do that because when you get a criminal defense case, that's really all you have. You have your client to tell you a narrative, but it's important to understand the perspective of the purported victim and what they may or may not be claiming, and understand it in a holistic way. There are, sets of questions that I have, that I've published, that I use for my CLEs. If you send me an email and want a redacted sample, I'd be happy to send it to you. But also ask for this list. It's a list of questions. They're not very long, but they concern physical abuse, drug abuse issues, sexual abuse issues, emotional, verbal, technology, financial, cultural, and religious abuse issues. It's several dozen questions that frame a psychosocial clinical evaluation to elicit information to gain a more holistic understanding about the case. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you continue to listen and grow or hopefully gain from these YouTube programs that have also been CLEs. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. Everything is in the description box and on my website as well. Thank you.